The history books say Adolf Hitler rose to power on the strength of broken promises and breadlines. They say the German people, humiliated by Versailles and starving through the Depression, turned to a fanatic who offered them someone to blame. That account is not wrong. But it stops precisely where the record becomes uncomfortable. Because the question the standard narrative declines to answer is not how Hitler mobilized the German public. The question is who mobilized the capital. A political movement does not print its own currency. An army does not manufacture its own steel. A government does not rebuild a war machine from scratch without someone arranging the financing, extending the credit lines, and structuring the transactions that make industrial rearmament possible on a continental scale. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. When you trace those transactions, when you follow the bank transfers and the loan agreements and the corporate directorates that connected Wall Street to the economic reconstruction of the Third Reich, you find a pattern of institutional decisions that the standard account of the Second World War was never constructed to expose. The men who made those decisions were not in the bunker in 1945. They were in boardrooms in Manhattan, in private banking offices in Zurich, in the correspondence files of American corporations that still operate today under familiar names. Their role was not suppressed through censorship. It was suppressed through emphasis, through the systematic omission of financial causation from a historical narrative built almost entirely around political and military events, around battles and treaties and the moral clarity of a war against fascism. That moral clarity was real. The outcome was correct. But the financial record behind it tells a different story about who paid for the machine before the war began and who collected afterward. To understand what the financial record shows, you have to begin where the money began, in the ruins of the German economy after 1918. The Treaty of Versailles imposed reparations calculated at 132 billion gold marks, a figure arrived at not through any precise accounting of war costs, but through a political negotiation between creditor governments whose finance ministries privately doubted the sum could ever be collected in full. John Maynard Keynes, serving in the British delegation to the Paris Peace Conference, resigned in protest and published The Economic Consequences of the Peace in 1919, warning explicitly that the reparations terms would produce economic chaos in Germany and political instability across Europe. His warning was not heeded. By 1923, the mark had collapsed so completely that a single American dollar purchased 4 trillion marks at the peak of the crisis. Workers were paid twice daily, so wages could be spent before the afternoon exchange rate erased their value. The middle class that had sustained Weimar's democratic institutions was financially annihilated in a matter of months. Lifetime savings held in mark-denominated accounts became worthless faster than they could be withdrawn. The political consequences of that destruction were still reverberating a decade later when the Great Depression finished what the inflation had started. The hyperinflation crisis was resolved, and the mechanism of its resolution was arranged almost entirely by American banking interests. The Dawes Plan of 1924, named after Charles G. Dawes, an American banker and diplomat who would shortly afterward become Vice President of the United States, restructured Germany's reparation schedule and opened a direct channel for American private capital to flow into Germany on an unprecedented scale. Under the plan's financial terms, Germany would receive 800 million gold marks in stabilization loans to anchor its new currency and restart its industrial base. Those loans came predominantly from American financial institutions, with J.P. Morgan & Company serving as the lead underwriter and coordinator of the German bond issue marketed to American investors. Morgan sold German government bonds throughout the second half of the 1920s, collecting substantial underwriting and placement fees while constructing an interlocking web of financial obligation between Wall Street and the Weimar Republic. The Young Plan of 1929, which revised the reparation schedule downward and extended its timeline, was similarly structured through American financial intermediaries, with Morgan again positioned at the center of the arrangement. By the end of the decade, American banks and private investors had extended the equivalent of roughly $2.5 to $3 billion in loans and bond purchases to German government and corporate borrowers. German municipal governments, German public utilities, and German industrial companies all tapped American capital markets during this period, often through Morgan-affiliated arrangements. The city of Berlin alone issued bonds in the American market. The German states of Bavaria, Saxony, and Prussia all did the same. That capital did not arrive without consequence for the institutional relationships it created. American bondholders now had a direct financial interest in German economic stability, and the banks that had underwritten and placed those bonds had an equally direct interest in maintaining the correspondent banking relationships that kept the transactions flowing. That concentration of externally held short-term capital, which could be withdrawn at any moment the creditor's own circumstances required, was the structural fault line that the Great Depression would expose. When American banks began withdrawing foreign-placed capital in 1929 to cover domestic losses, Germany was among the first and most severely affected economies. Unemployment climbed above 30%. Industrial output contracted by close to half in 3 years. The Weimar Republic buckled under the combined weight of mass unemployment and fiscal collapse. The loans that had stabilized Germany in the 1920s had simultaneously made it catastrophically vulnerable to the next external shock. The period between 1930 and 1933 is narrated in most accounts as a story of electoral competition and political miscalculation, of a conservative establishment that brought Hitler into government believing it could control him. That account is accurate as far as it goes. Running alongside it was a financial story that has received a fraction of the scholarly attention its documentation warrants. German heavy industry, rebuilt through the 1920s with American loan capital and now facing devastating losses in the Depression, was actively looking for a government that would protect its interests through state expenditure on military production, through the suppression of organized labor, and through the reconstruction of Germany's full military capacity in defiance of Versailles. Fritz Treason, whose Vereinigte Stahlwerke accounted for roughly 40% of Germany's pig iron production and a third of its steel output, had been contributing to the Nazi Party since as early as 1923. He later estimated in his memoir, published in 1941 under the title I Paid Hitler, that his total contributions amounted to approximately 1 million marks. He wrote the book in exile after breaking with Hitler in 1939 over the invasion of Poland, arguing that he had been deceived about the nature of the regime he helped to finance. The self-exculpatory framing does not alter the documentary record. Tisson's steel was the material basis of every tank, every warship, and every gun barrel the Wehrmacht eventually put into the field. His money purchased political access at the precise moment when access determined the direction of a nation of 66 million people. The Ruhr industrialists who backed Hitler were acting on a coherent economic calculation. They had watched the Weimar Republic fail to protect their interests against organized labor, fail to deliver stable export markets, and fail to rebuild the military capacity that would have given Germany the continental leverage its industrial scale required. Their financial support was an investment made on the basis of a straightforward expectation. A strong nationalist government would deliver rearmament, suppress the trade unions, and create the conditions for profitable production on a scale that the Depression had made impossible. That calculation was correct in the short term. The rearmament program delivered exactly what the industrialists had paid for. What it required in addition to domestic financing was a continuing relationship with the international financial system, because the steel, the chemicals, the machinery, and above all the hard currency that rearmament demanded could not all be sourced domestically. Hjalmar Schacht, who served as Hitler's economics minister and Reichsbank president, was the architect of the financial instruments that kept the rearmament program solvent. His Mefo bills, the mechanism through which the Nazi government financed early rearmament off its official budget, were structured around a shell company called the Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft, which had no operational function beyond providing a legal vehicle through which the Reichsbank could guarantee off-budget government spending without the liability appearing in the official accounts. The bills were guaranteed by the Reichsbank and discounted by the private German banking system, but their creditworthiness depended on the continued functioning of the international financial relationships that connected Germany to external capital markets. Between 1933 and 1938, the Nazi government issued roughly 12 billion Reichsmarks in Mefo bills to fund rearmament. By the time the program wound down, the German military had been rebuilt from the limitations imposed at Versailles to a continental force capable of the campaigns that followed. That outcome was the product of domestic financial engineering working in combination with the international commercial relationships that had survived the transition from the Weimar government to the Nazi one. The moment those external relationships collapsed, the rearmament program would have faced a hard currency constraint that domestic financial engineering alone could not resolve. Thyssen's primary banking relationship in this period ran through the Bank voor Handel en Scheepvaart, a Dutch institution in Rotterdam. That bank maintained a correspondent relationship with a small private bank in New York called the Union Banking Corporation. Union Banking's board of directors included Prescott Bush, a partner at the investment house Brown Brothers Harriman, alongside directors with documented connections to German industrial and financial concerns. Brown Brothers Harriman was at the time one of the most established private banking houses on Wall Street, with a client base that included some of the largest American industrial and financial interests. In October of 1942, the United States government seized the Union Banking Corporation under the Trading with the Enemy Act. 4 related business entities associated with the same network were seized in the same period, including the Holland American Trading Corporation and the Seamless Steel Equipment Corporation. The government's formal determination was that the bank had functioned as a financial conduit for German-held assets connected to interests tied to the Nazi economic apparatus. The records of that seizure are held unclassified in the National Archives in Washington. They name the directors, describe the correspondent relationships, and document the government's findings in sufficient detail that subsequent researchers have been able to trace the institutional connections through multiple layers of corporate structure. The assets seized were eventually returned to their shareholders after the war, with the value of the Union Banking Corporation's shares distributed to its registered owners. Prescott Bush received approximately $1,500,000 from that distribution. Those records have been cited in specialist literature and in investigative journalism. They have not altered the popular understanding of how the war was financed, because that popular understanding was not constructed around the financial record. Standard Oil of New Jersey maintained a cartel agreement with IG Farben, the German chemical and industrial conglomerate that was by the mid-1930s the most consequential single corporate structure in the Nazi military production system. The arrangement was formalized through a series of agreements dating to the 1920s that divided global markets and cross-licensed patents across a range of industrial technologies. The most consequential exchange involved synthetic rubber and synthetic fuel. Standard Oil possessed critical knowledge in the production of Buna rubber derived from petroleum feedstocks. IG Farben held related patents in synthetic fuel production. The cross-licensing arrangement meant that IG Farben had full access to Buna technology throughout the 1930s, while the American military, which discovered a catastrophic shortage of natural rubber when Japan cut off Pacific supply routes in late 1941, could not obtain full access to Standard Oil's synthetic rubber knowledge because that knowledge remained encumbered by the cartel structure. Senator Harry Truman, then chairing the Senate Special Committee to investigate the National Defense Program, stated publicly and on the record in 1942 that Standard Oil's conduct in this matter amounted to treason. Standard Oil paid civil fines totaling roughly $57,000. No criminal charges were brought against any executive of the company. IG Farben's involvement in the Nazi economy extended across virtually every dimension of the regime's industrial program. By 1938, it was the largest private corporation in Europe. It manufactured the Zyklon B used in the extermination camps. It operated a synthetic rubber and fuel production facility at Monowitz, directly adjacent to the Auschwitz concentration camp complex, staffed with prisoner labor drawn from the camp. Its directors held supervisory board seats at the major German banks, and those banks maintained active transaction relationships with American and British financial institutions throughout the 1930s. Henry Ford's relationship with the Nazi movement was sufficiently direct that Hitler maintained a portrait of Ford in his Munich office and cited Ford's anti-Semitic publication, The International Jew, in his own writing. Ford-Werke, the German subsidiary headquartered in Cologne, continued operating through the war, producing military trucks for the German armed forces. A report commissioned by Ford itself in 1974, researched by the historian Simon Reich using the company's own archives and the records of the United States military government in Germany, confirmed that Ford-Werke had produced military vehicles for the Wehrmacht and had operated with forced labor. The report was produced by the company and made available to researchers. It generated limited public attention before returning to the specialized literature. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. General Motors had acquired Opel, Germany's largest automobile manufacturer, for approximately $33 million in 1931. Opel was by the mid-1930s producing the Blitz truck, the standard light military transport vehicle of the German army, in sufficient volume to supply the motorization program that the Wehrmacht's planners had determined was necessary for the kind of mobile warfare Germany intended to conduct. Alfred Sloan, GM's chairman, maintained in internal correspondence that commercial decisions should not be made on the basis of the political character of a host government. James Mooney, the GM executive who managed the company's European operations, met personally with Hitler in 1934 and was awarded the Eagle with Cross Order of the German Eagle by the Nazi government in 1938, the same decoration awarded to Henry Ford. The Nazi government's restrictions on the repatriation of profits from German subsidiaries created a structural incentive to reinvest in German operations rather than attempt to exit, since the money could not in any case be moved out of the country. The blocked mark accounts in which those profits accumulated were most productively deployed by reinvesting in expanded production capacity. That reinvestment, in the context of a government whose primary economic program was military rearmament, meant that blocked corporate profits were consistently channeled into the expansion of production facilities that served the Wehrmacht's requirements. That incentive does not constitute a moral defense. It accurately describes the institutional logic that consistently pointed the corporations toward continued production and away from any decision that would have required accepting a financial loss in exchange for disengaging from the regime's industrial program. The institution whose wartime conduct most systematically documents the depth of the problem was not a private corporation but an international bank. The Bank for International Settlements was established in Basel, Switzerland in 1930 to administer the transfer of German reparation payments. By the outbreak of the Second World War, it had evolved into the primary clearing mechanism through which the world's major central banks settled international accounts. Its board in 1939 included representatives of the German Reichsbank, the Bank of England, the Federal Reserve, and the central banks of France, Belgium, and several other nations. When war broke out, the board voted to maintain the institution's operations and its formal neutrality, which meant the BIS continued to function as a settlement mechanism accessible to both Allied and Axis financial systems through the entire course of the conflict. The most consequential result of that arrangement was the BIS's acceptance of gold transferred from the German Reichsbank during the war years. The Bergier Commission, established by the Swiss federal government in 1996, confirmed in its final published report in 1999 that substantial portions of the gold received by the BIS and by Swiss commercial banks had been removed from the central bank reserves of countries occupied by Germany, including the reserves of Belgium, the Netherlands, and Czechoslovakia. A further portion had been extracted from individuals murdered in the extermination camp system, processed through Reichsbank channels, and entered into the international clearing system as ordinary central bank settlement. The Eisenstadt reports, produced by the United States State Department in 1997 and 1998 under Stuart Eisenstadt, drew on American archival material, including wartime Treasury Department cables and intelligence assessments, to confirm and extend those findings. The cable traffic between the American Treasury and its diplomatic representatives in Bern during the war years documents that senior American officials were aware in real time that the BIS was accepting gold whose origins were inconsistent with legitimate central bank reserves. That knowledge was noted and registered diplomatically. It did not produce an institutional response proportionate to what the cables described. At the Bretton Woods Conference in July of 1944, the Norwegian delegation introduced a resolution calling for the liquidation of the Bank for International Settlements at the earliest possible moment. The resolution passed with broad support from the assembled delegations of 44 nations. It was never implemented. In the period between the conference vote and the end of the war, the institutional momentum for dissolution dissipated as financial officials on both the British and American sides concluded that the BIS's operational infrastructure was useful for post-war monetary coordination. The bank opened new and considerably larger headquarters buildings in Basel over subsequent decades. Today it serves as the secretariat for the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, the body whose capital adequacy standards govern major banks in 60 countries, and as the operational hub through which the central bank governors of the G20 nations coordinate monetary policy. The accounting that followed the war addressed the crimes of the Nazi state with considerable force. It addressed the financial and industrial architecture that had made those crimes possible at the scale at which they occurred, with considerably less. The Nuremberg trials were the most extensive judicial proceeding in modern history. They established individual criminal liability for a set of political and military actors, whose guilt was documented beyond any reasonable standard of proof. What the trials were not designed to do, and did not do, was examine the transnational corporate and banking relationships that had capitalized the rearmament program from 1933 onward. That omission was not accidental. The Allied governments that constructed the prosecution at Nuremberg were the same governments whose financial institutions had participated in those relationships, and whose post-war reconstruction plans depended on the continued functioning of many of the same corporations. The Marshall Plan, announced in June of 1947 and implemented from April of 1948, channeled $13 billion of American capital into the reconstruction of Western European economies. The German industrial firms and banks that received Marshall Plan reconstruction funding were in many cases the same institutions whose pre-war and wartime conduct had been examined in the Nuremberg proceedings. The logic of reconstruction required that they be rebuilt and made productive, and that logic prevailed over any competing impulse toward a more thorough institutional accounting. 24 IG Farben directors were tried before a military tribunal. 13 were convicted. The longest sentence handed down was 8 years. Most were released within 3 years of conviction and returned to senior positions in the successor pharmaceutical and chemical companies reconstituted from Farben's assets. Those successor companies were not marginal operations. They were reconstituted into firms that became some of the largest corporations in post-war Western Germany, and their products appear on pharmacy shelves in dozens of countries today. The institutional lineage from IG Farben to its post-war successors was a matter of public record. It did not prevent those successors from becoming the dominant companies in their respective industries. No American corporate executive was tried at Nuremberg or in any subsequent proceeding connected to wartime commercial conduct. Standard Oil's civil fines under trade regulations bore no relationship to the scale of the military advantage the cartel arrangements had provided to German synthetic fuel and rubber production. The legal framework applied to corporate conduct was one that treated the commercial relationship as separable from the military outcome it materially supported. That framework was established in 1945, and it has not been substantially revised since. What the documentary record shows, when assembled from the congressional hearings of the early 1940s, the Nuremberg trial transcripts, the Bergier Commission findings, and the Eisenstadt reports, is a pattern of institutional decision-making that operated on a consistent logic across multiple countries and multiple corporate structures. The logic was not ideological. The German industrial firms that financed the Nazi Party did so because they believed a nationalist government would deliver the labor suppression and rearmament spending their balance sheets required. The American corporations that maintained cartel agreements with IG Farben did so because those agreements protected patent positions and market allocations that their shareholders valued. The International Bank in Basel that accepted Reichsbank gold during the war did so because its founding charter and the diplomatic conventions that protected its neutrality gave it no legal mechanism to refuse. Each decision, examined in isolation, operated within a legal framework that permitted it. The aggregate of those decisions was the financial infrastructure of a war that killed between 70 and 85 million people. The post-war settlements addressed that aggregate through a combination of limited criminal prosecution and negotiated financial compensation. The German government and a consortium of German corporations established the Remembrance, Responsibility, and Future Foundation in the year 2000 to compensate surviving victims of forced labor. The foundation raised 10 billion Deutsche Marks from corporate contributors and the German federal government. The corporations that contributed did so without admitting legal liability. The compensation amounts paid to individual survivors were, in many cases, a few thousand euros per person for years of forced labor in conditions that had been deliberately designed to work the laborers to death. The foundation's name acknowledged the record. The terms of its establishment ensured that acknowledgement carried no legal consequence for the institutions that had profited from the conduct it memorialized. The question of what the financial record shows is therefore a different question from the one the standard account was designed to address. The standard account asks who was responsible for the Second World War. The answer it provides focuses on the political decisions made in Berlin and the military campaign that followed from them. That answer is accurate and supported by overwhelming evidence. The financial record asks a supplementary question. What made the scale of that campaign possible, and what happened to the institutions that provided the capital for it? The answer to that question is documented in archives that have been open for decades. The Prescott Bush connection to union banking and its German industrial clients was examined in congressional proceedings during the war and in journalistic investigations beginning in the 1980s. The Standard Oil IG Farben cartel agreements were placed in evidence before the Truman Committee in 1942 and have been the subject of academic monographs since at least the 1970s. The BIS gold transactions were the subject of Allied diplomatic cables during the war, a Bretton Woods resolution in 1944, and a Swiss Federal Commission report 55 years later. The Ford-Werke forced labor findings were produced by the company's own commissioned historian. None of these disclosures was classified or suppressed in the conventional sense. Each was made in a context that ensured it would remain within the specialized literature rather than altering the general public's understanding of how the war was financed. The Eisenstadt reports of 1997 and 1998 came closer than any prior official process to assembling those threads into a single account. Stuart Eisenstadt, then serving as Undersecretary of State for Economic, Business, and Agricultural Affairs, oversaw the production of two reports drawing on 11 agencies of the federal government and 11 million pages of wartime records. The reports confirmed that the United States government had been aware during the war that neutral countries, Switzerland in particular, had been accepting German gold whose origins in occupied central bank reserves were evident from the shipping documentation. The Tripartite Gold Commission, established in 1946 to recover and redistribute looted monetary gold to the countries from which it had been taken, had by the time of its final disbursement in 1998 returned roughly $377 million of gold to claimant nations. The Bergier Commission's subsequent analysis estimated that Germany had looted approximately $580 million in gold from the central banks of occupied countries, measured at wartime gold prices. The gap between what was looted and what was recovered is documented in the Commission's published report and has not been disputed. The reports also confirmed that post-war Allied negotiations over that gold had produced settlements that recovered only a fraction of what the documentary record showed had been transferred. The political context in which those negotiations had occurred, specifically the onset of the Cold War and the consequent need to stabilize Western European economies and governments as rapidly as possible, had placed a ceiling on how aggressively the Allied governments were prepared to pursue asset recovery from neutral countries, whose continued cooperation was now required for a different strategic purpose. The gold settlements of 1946 and 1947 were not the result of incomplete information, they were the result of competing priorities, and the competing priority that prevailed was not the recovery of assets extracted from murdered civilians. It was the stabilization of a Western European financial system that the same institutions had helped to design. The Bank for International Settlements remains in operation in Basel. Its current membership includes the central banks of 63 countries. Its annual reports are published and available. Its role in the coordination of international monetary policy has expanded substantially since the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision was established in 1974, in direct response to the failure of the Herstatt Bank in Cologne, a failure that exposed the absence of any international framework for managing cross-border bank insolvencies. The BIS today sets the capital adequacy standards, known as the Basel Accords, that determine how much capital every major bank in every major economy is required to hold against its risk-weighted assets. The institution created to manage German reparation payments in 1930, which maintained formal neutrality through a war, during which it processed gold extracted from occupied central bank reserves and from murder victims, became the body that sets the prudential standards for the global banking system. That transition was not the result of the institution's wartime conduct being exonerated. It was the result of the institution's operational infrastructure being too useful to discard. The resolution passed at Bretton Woods in 1944, calling for its liquidation, was set aside, and the institution continued. The record of what it processed between 1939 and 1945 sits in the Bergier Commission's published findings, which are available in English translation and have been since 1999. The full pattern across these cases follows the same structural logic. The financial and industrial relationships that sustained the Nazi economy were built in the ordinary course of commercial activity during the 1920s and early 1930s, under legal frameworks that permitted them, and at a time when their consequences were not fully visible to everyone who participated in them. By the time those consequences were visible beyond any reasonable doubt, the relationships were so embedded in the institutional architecture of the international economy that severing them carried costs the relevant governments and corporations were not prepared to accept. The relationships between American financial institutions and German industrial borrowers had been constructed through the Dawes Plan with the active encouragement of both governments. The cartel arrangements between Standard Oil and IG Farben had been reviewed by American antitrust authorities in the 1920s without producing a prohibition. The correspondent banking relationships between the Union Banking Corporation and the Bank voor Handel en Scheepvaart in Rotterdam had been conducted through ordinary commercial channels. The BIS had been created by treaty. Each institution could point to a founding document, a regulatory approval, or a governmental mandate that placed its activities within a recognized legal category. The argument that has sustained the continuity of those institutions through every decade and every proceeding since is that they operated within the law as it existed at the time, that commercial relationships cannot be held accountable for the political uses to which capital is ultimately put, and that any alternative standard of institutional liability would be unworkable in a complex international economy. That argument was accepted in 1945. It was accepted again when the Eisenstadt reports produced negotiated settlements rather than prosecutions. It is the argument that permitted the IG Farben directors to return to corporate leadership within 3 years of their convictions. It is the argument that allowed Standard Oil to resolve a charge of wartime treason with a civil fine smaller than the cost of a single fighter aircraft. The ledger is balanced, the accounts are closed, the institutions remain open for business, and the record of what they financed sits in the archives, available to anyone prepared to read it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.